had originally planned to spend the night at home, but things didn't go as expected. So, at midnight, I found myself driving alone on the highway. It wasn't something I was used to, but sometimes life throws these unexpected moments at you. Everything was so calm, so quiet. The only light came from the headlights on the right side of the road, stretching out into the dark like thin, fragile lines. I still felt a little buzzed from the fresh tea I'd had just a few minutes ago, keeping me oddly awake. Meanwhile, I was driving at a comfortable pace in my car, not thinking much of it. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted a figure by the side of the road. As my headlights slowly illuminated it, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, sitting in the dark by the highway, holding her phone. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes, and my car slowed down. The woman turned to face me, her gaze fixed in my direction. For a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. She was wearing a plain dress, and everything about her seemed out of place. I slowly rolled down my window and called out, "Can I help you?" The woman turned her eyes towards me, but there was something off about her gaze. No fear, no emotion, just emptiness. It was like she wasn't even really looking at me. I can't even describe it properly. Her eyes were vacant, like she wasn't really present. She told me her phone was broken and that she needed help. A million questions rushed through my mind. Why was she here at this hour, all alone? Why would someone's phone break by the side of the highway in the middle of nowhere? But despite the confusion, I felt a strange pull to help her. I passed a few meters behind her and then made a split-second decision. I got out of my car. The moment I stepped onto the road, a weird feeling crept over me. That stare, her eyes still fixed, still emotionless, felt like they were pulling me in. I didn't feel scared, but something was wrong. It was like there was a weight pressing down on my chest that I couldn't quite understand. I took a step forward, but just then, a cold breeze swept behind me, making my skin crawl. It was completely out of place, as if something wasn't right. The woman repeated, "The car broke down. Please help me." But this time, her voice was different, flat, empty, like she wasn't really speaking to me at all. It was as though she wasn't really present in her own body. That's when I started to feel something deep inside me telling me to leave, to get away from her, to not help. But there was no sound around us, just silence. The darkness seemed to grow thicker around her, pressing in from all sides. I took a step back, heart racing. Something in me told me this wasn't normal. I headed back to my car, opening the door quickly, eager to get inside and away from whatever was happening. But as I did, I noticed something chilling. The woman hadn't moved, not even an inch. Yet, her gaze, something was different this time. Her eyes were still fixed on me, but now she was a step behind where she had been before. A sharp thought struck me. How could she be a step behind so quickly? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind went blank for a moment as I tried to make sense of it. How had she moved so fast? I couldn't see her physically moving, but somehow I knew something wasn't right. I quickly slammed the door shut and started my car, my hands shaking. As I drove off, I felt a strange compulsion to look back. I couldn't help it, and when I did, the woman was still there. She hadn't moved, not visibly, but I knew she was still watching me with those same empty eyes. It felt like she was closer, even though she shouldn't have been. I sped up, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. Just then, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was a blocked number. My heart skipped a beat. I answered, my voice trembling. The voice on the other end was low, deep, and chilling. It seemed to seep into my bones with every word. "Don't follow the woman," the voice said. "She's a ghost." I felt my body freeze. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My brain scrambled to process it, but all I could do was glance back at the woman once again. Those same empty eyes locked onto me. She wasn't moving, but she was still there. And now, it was like everything had fallen into place. She was a ghost. I slammed my foot on the gas and drove as fast as I could. I didn't dare look back again. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. All I could hear was the roar of the engine and my own breathing. The road ahead seemed endless, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. And then, behind me, I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't the woman's laugh, or anyone's laugh, for that matter. It was deep, eerie, like something unnatural, something not of this world. In that moment, the only thing that made sense was this: following a ghost meant losing yourself. I was terrified, my body shaking, my thoughts spinning. Everything the voice on the phone had said was true. I shouldn't have helped her. I shouldn't have followed her. But it was too late now. Whatever had happened, whatever I had seen, it was beyond my understanding. All I knew was that I had gotten too close to something that wasn't meant to be touched. Traveling has always been my way of escaping, leaving the city behind, getting away from the constant noise of traffic, the ping of notifications, and the demands of work. A few days to clear my head, to breathe. That morning, I grabbed my car keys and decided to take off for a long drive. The road was empty, and I planned to spend the night in a small village before heading back home. Just me, the open road, nothing else. For hours, I drove down the highway. The car was moving fast, and on the radio, there was nothing but static. I adjusted the dial a few times, trying to find something to listen to, but the static wouldn't stop. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the stations were weak, or something had gone wrong with the signal. But as the minutes passed, the static grew more intense, almost like it was fighting to break through. Then, something changed. The static became more piercing, and when the radio cut out, I could hear faint whispers. They weren't very clear at first, just strange murmurs. But as I listened more closely, they grew louder. It was the sound of a woman, crying, screaming. I turned the volume up, hoping to hear better, and suddenly the voices became crystal clear. "Help, don't find me." A chill swept through me. I felt it deep in my bones. Fear crept into my chest as the woman's voice echoed through the car. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind couldn't stop listening. The woman's cries grew louder, her voice trembling with desperation. "She will find you." My heart started racing. I took my eyes off the road for a moment, glancing at the radio screen. It still looked normal, but that wasn't possible. It felt as though the woman was speaking directly to me, trying to reach out from the static. Just as quickly as the voices had come, the static died down into an eerie silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that makes you aware of just how alone you are. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My stomach twisted in knots. A few minutes passed, and then it started again. The radio suddenly exploded into a chaotic burst of sound. Screams, frantic whispers, more intense this time. The woman's voice was clearer, more urgent. "Don't find me, help me." I couldn't ignore it anymore. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I yanked the steering wheel. The moment the car came to a stop, the sounds stopped. It was like someone had pressed pause. Everything fell into an unnerving quiet. I was about to open the door when I noticed something strange. The rocks on the roadside had been moved. The ground was disturbed. For a moment, I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. The sounds, the woman's voice, and now this it was like a message I couldn't quite decipher. I turned off the radio, but the voices still echoed in my mind. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay there. So I got back in the car and drove on, hoping the road would lead me to answers or at least to a way out. But the further I drove, the more bizarre things got. Strange tracks by the side of the road, marks I hadn't noticed before. It felt like something had been following me, leaving signs, almost as if I were being guided or hunted. My mind was racing as I drove, my pulse quickening with each mile, and then it happened. When I hit the brakes, something appeared on the rear window, a strange, distorted shape. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat. I quickly turned my gaze back to the road, pressing my foot harder on the gas. The noises were getting louder, now screams, whispers, panic. It was like I couldn't escape it. The further I went, the more strange marks appeared. I was terrified, but part of me, some irrational part, felt like I had to keep going, like I had to find out what these sounds were leading me to. A few hours later, I passed by an abandoned village. It looked like no one had lived there in years, but there was something unsettling about the place now. The marks, the screams, the whispers, it all felt connected. As I pulled the car over, the air seemed thick with tension. I realized something. Whatever had happened to that woman, whoever she was, I might be too late to stop it. The sounds, the eerie calls for help, were pulling me somewhere, urging me to uncover the truth. But was it a game? Or was there a real story buried hereof? A woman who had disappeared, or worse, been murdered. The thought gripped me, and I knew I had to keep going. But I couldn't ignore the voice in my head that warned me, turned back. I started the car again, trying to push away the fear that had started to settle deep inside me. But this time, the voices felt closer, so close that they seemed to be right next to me inside the car. Don't go closer. Turn back. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. As I was about to start the car again, another scream echoed this time, so loud and close it shook me to the core. I couldn't help it. I glanced into the rearview mirror, and there she was. My heart stopped. She was standing there, right behind me, her face twisted in a silent scream. My fear swelled up inside me, mixing with confusion and terror. The sounds slowly faded, but her eyes, those eyes, were still watching me from behind. She wasn't just a memory, a lost echo of the past. She was real, and with every second, I was getting closer to her. I chose to set out for the journey at night. There's something about the quiet of the evening that's almost hypnotic, and I needed that peace. The world outside was still, and the hum of the car was the only sound that kept me company. The air was cool, but inside, the car was warm and comfortable, a little cocoon of safety in an otherwise cold, dark world. I had been working non-stop for days, and the thought of a long drive in solitude was a welcome escape. My thoughts drifted away from the hustle of everyday life. I wasn't thinking of work or deadlines, only of getting home, slipping into my bed, and sinking into a deep, restful sleep. The highway stretched out before me, nearly empty, with just the occasional flicker of road lights in the distance. The endless stretch of asphalt was a calming sight. I could feel the road under the tires, the way it hummed softly beneath the weight of the car, a rhythm that felt like it matched my heartbeat. For hours, I kept driving, my mind floating between thoughts, half dreams, and the rhythmic pulse of the road. It was the kind of journey that should have been uneventful. But then, something felt off. I noticed a car parked by the side of the road. It wasn't exactly unusual to see a car left behind in the middle of nowhere, but something about it didn't sit right. It was parked in the left lane, just outside of a small curve, and at that hour, the highway was so empty that it seemed impossible anyone could have broken down. There were no other cars around, no lights in the distance. The doors were closed, the windows rolled up, but the engine was still warm, which meant whoever had left the car had just walked away. I thought about stopping, but curiosity didn't push me far enough. I kept driving, assuming it was just another case of someone breaking down or pulling over for some reason. As I continued along the road, I tried to shake off the unease that had slowly started creeping into my chest. A few kilometers later, I crossed a bridge that spanned over a small river. The headlights of another car suddenly appeared from behind, speeding toward me at a startling rate. I didn't expect it, and when I saw it pull up next to me, I realized it was the same car I had just passed. The same exact car. My heart skipped a beat. But now, something was different. The car was completely empty. I couldn't comprehend it. Just moments ago, it had been parked on the side of the road with no one in sight. But as it sped beside me, I could see clearly there was no one inside. The doors were shut, the windows rolled up, but the vehicle was moving as if it was being driven by someone. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I should have felt panic, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The car was moving too fast, and my brain couldn't process what was happening. The headlights were blinding, and as I glanced down at the road ahead, I had to look back at the car again. And then it happened. Just a hand stuck out of the window. It was eerily still, hanging there in the dark like it was waving, but there was no body attached to it. It was just a hand hanging from the empty window. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked a few times, almost convincing myself I had imagined it. But when I looked again, the hand was still there, waving, and the car continued to speed away from me as if nothing was wrong. My heart raced. The hand was unnatural. It shouldn't have been there. In that moment, I realized I was no longer in control of my own thoughts. I couldn't rationalize what I had seen. I could feel the fear building up in me like a pressure that couldn't be released. I quickly turned my gaze back to the road ahead. I needed to focus. I had to. But I couldn't shake the image of that hand. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, hoping to put more distance between myself and the strange occurrence. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it all. But the drive seemed to stretch on longer than usual. It felt like the more I drove, the more time slipped away from me. Finally, I arrived home. I rushed inside, desperate for the safety of my own space. I turned on the news without even thinking, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The car, the one I had seen earlier, the one that had been parked by the side of the road, the one that had sped past me, was on the news. The report said it had been abandoned, just as I had seen. But what caught my attention was the chilling detail that the driver of the car was now missing. And the worst part, the police believed the driver had been murdered. They showed a picture of the car, the exact same one I had seen on the road. The car was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was connected to something far darker. I felt dizzy. The coincidence was too much to ignore, too real. The hand, it hadn't been a trick of the light. I had seen it, but who had been there to wave it? There was no one inside the car, but that hand had been so clear, so deliberate. It was as if it was trying to tell me something. The story from the news didn't help the fear that was still tightening around my chest. And then it hit me. I remembered the shadow. When I had passed the car earlier, I had noticed something in the back seat, but I hadn't registered it at the time. It was just a shadow, just a flicker. But now I could see it clearly in my mind. That shadow, it wasn't just a trick. It had been something that wasn't supposed to be there. The news continued to report the details of the murder, but I wasn't hearing it anymore. My thoughts were spiraling. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow, the face in the rearview mirror, the cold sensation that had washed over me when I saw it. I had parked the car on the side of the road, thinking nothing of it, but that's when I saw the shadow in the rear window. It had been there, and it hadn't gone away. I kept replaying that moment in my head, over and over. The hand, the shadow, the empty car. What had I witnessed? Was it a ghost? A warning? A sign? The thought of it gnawed at me, ... As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was with me. It was the feeling of being watched, of being followed. My body was tense, every little noise setting me on edge. I could feel it, whatever had been in that car, whatever had shown me that hand, was still with me. The next day, I couldn't leave my house. I kept staring at the back of my car, half expecting to see something in the rear window. Every time I checked the mirrors, I saw nothing, but I could still feel it, that presence lingering behind me. It was the same hand, the same shadow, the same unsettling chill. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. It was real, and I couldn't escape it. The missing driver on the roadside, the abandoned car, the hand in the window. It all kept coming back to me, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And as the days passed, I knew that I would never be able to forget that night. The hand, the shadow, the face in the rear window. They were still with me, always.